It was the worst loss she had ever grieved. And yet her church was silent. Many churches are silent on this subject. But these were the words of my mother-in-law referring to the miscarriage my wife and I experienced back in 2012. I'm Pastor Jacob, and I believe that the church needs to speak up about the grief that surrounds lost pregnancies. I think it's a difficult subject, really, for most people to get into. It gets into questions of when does life begin? Difficult questions like what happens if it is a life, yet it wasn't baptized? It's not a professing believer, it was an infant baptized. If it was alive, if the child was alive, then where is it eternally? What constitutes life? What constitutes death? These are all really difficult questions, and there's not really a unified global answer to it. And so in most cases, the church is often silent. A grieving heart is a grieving heart, and Jesus would want those hearts to be comforted. It's for these reasons that as my final project in my worship class, I'm designing a service, a community service of grief and healing for a lost pregnancy. Have you or someone that you love experienced a lost pregnancy? If so, I'm guessing that you might be familiar with their feelings of guilt, of self-criticism, of questioning the nature of God, maybe. All of these things played into my personal experience. And I have a few answers that I want to share with you in this video. When somebody is older and we're trying to determine whether they're alive or dead, some of the things that are looked for is, do they have a pulse? And do they have breath in their lungs? And is there any brain function? Well, nowadays through ultrasound technology, we can find that an infant in the womb still has a pulse, has lung functioning, and has brain activity. So I think it's not too difficult to say that life begins before birth, but I don't know if there's enough evidence yet to say that it begins exactly at conception. All I know is that when my wife and I were expecting, this was January of 2012, at about 6 weeks we went to her doctor's office and we got to see the heartbeat on the screen. And at that time my heart came alive in a way that I did not know was possible. It was the first time that we were expecting a child. And the joy and the hope that filled my heart in that moment is literally unexplainable. Perhaps you've experienced this as well. Unfortunately, less than a week later, my wife went in for another appointment and they were unable to find the heartbeat. And for a few days there, it felt like I couldn't find my own either. In the midst of this loss, a number of folks from our church came to us and shared their experiences of having gone through this exact same thing. People that I dealt with on a regular basis. I knew their families, I knew their stories, but I hadn't heard this story. So many people deal with the grief of a lost pregnancy silently and alone. So many people deal with this loss as if it was their fault for some reason, that God may be punishing them. One of the most important aspects of the service that I'm planning is this. This death was not God's will. And I had somebody proofread the paper, and it was actually my sister-in-law, and she called that line into question. She said, "But isn't God in charge of all life and death? And so therefore wouldn't this death and all deaths be God's will?" This is really, really predominant in popular theology these days. That God is all-powerful. And yes, God is all-powerful. But God also gave humans choice. God's will is for life, and life abundantly. Death is a product of sin, and sin is a product of our choice. So we, as humans, bring about death, if you're thinking theologically. So this death, or any death that you're suffering, is not God's will. God mourns with you. God suffers with you. There are other people who have theology that says God can't suffer. Well, my friends, it's in the historic words of the Apostles' Creed. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. God suffered. So in your suffering, understand that you are not alone. This is not your fault. God did not will this to happen, and it is not a punishment. But instead, understand that life is so fragile. 1 minute we can have breath, and the next minute it can be gone. 1 minute we can have a pulse, and the next minute it can be gone. In a single moment, our entire lives can change. In a single moment, our entire worlds can change. And my friends, I want you to know that where your heart is broken, that God is right there with you. And the body of Christ, through the people in the church, should be there too. If they haven't been, in your experience, I'm sorry. Sometimes well-intending Christians say really hurtful things in a time of pain and suffering. We all want to make something better. Yet, some of us don't quite understand that sometimes there's nothing you can say to make your heart stop hurting. This is a difficult subject for me to open up about. It's a death that I don't know if I've ever fully grieved, because I don't know how. That's, again, part of the reason I'm designing this service, is because I think there are others like my wife and I and my family out there who have suffered this loss and don't know really what to do with it. Do you say that you have 3 children? Or do you say that you have 2? I've got 2 living children. And I saw that heartbeat. And just as my heart went up, my heart broke. And I don't know if it will ever be the same. Life is fragile. Life should be celebrated. And a loss of life should be grieved. The God I know, the God that I worship, wept with his friends when their loved one passed away. The God that I know and worship was there for them. The God that I know and worship, even in the midst of our suffering, is with us. You may say, if God is all-powerful, why didn't God stop this? Where was God when? Where was God when? In the wise words of an old pastor friend, Reverend Mike Nichols, he said, in the moment of your grief, in the moment of your suffering, God was where God has been. And that's on the cross, suffering alongside us. My friends, is there a hurt in your heart that you've never fully grieved? If so, I invite you to grieve it, to share that loss, to make it public, to grieve what hurts. I'm Pastor Jacob, and I say it is okay. It is okay to grieve a life that never was. I love you, and I'm sorry. There's nothing I can say to make it better. But you can know that you're not alone, and that God is still good, and God is still loving, and God still cares for you.